Hi, this is Mark Ias. I'm an elder in the Boston Church of Christ, and this is the third video in a small series circling around the Assyrian invasion of Judah and siege on Jerusalem. And this video is called Payback, Converting Revenge into Compassion. The previous video was called Voices, Finding God's Voice. But this time we want to encourage you to be your best you by using your energies for compassion. Why is this such a challenge? Well, let's view the invasion again from the eyes of the Jews. Now, this event is recorded in the Bible in three places, and we're going to sample the 2 Chronicles 32 version and also jump around a little bit in some of the prophets. So let's get a feel for the emotions surrounding the event, and we're in 2 Chronicles 32. Verse 2. Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib had come and that he planned war on Jerusalem. So he consulted with his officials and his warriors about stopping up the waters of the springs that were outside the city, and they helped him. Verse 5. Then Hezekiah strengthened his position by rebuilding the entire broken down wall and heightening the towers in the other outside wall. He repaired the supporting terraces of the city of David and made an abundance of weapons and shields. He set military commanders over the people and gathered the people in the square of the city gate. And then he encouraged them, saying, "Be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid or discouraged before the king of Assyria or before the large army that is with him, for there are more with us than with him. He has only human strength, but we have Yahweh, our God, to help us and to fight our battles." So the people relied on the words of Hezekiah of Judah. In verse 9, after this, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, with all his armed forces, besieged Lachish. He sent his servants to Jerusalem against King Hezekiah of Judah and against all of those of Judah who were in Jerusalem. In verse 11, isn't Hezekiah misleading you to give you over to death by famine and thirst when he says, Yahweh, our God, will deliver us from the power of the king of Assyria? Don't you know what I and my fathers have done to all the peoples of the lands? Have any of the national gods of the lands been able to deliver their land from my power? In verse 18, then they called out loudly in Hebrew to the people of Jerusalem who were on the wall, to frighten and discourage them in order that he might capture the city. Now, if you look around on the web, you'll find out about the cruelty of the Assyrians. And there is, in fact, a site entitled Cruelty, the Instrument of Assyrian Control. And I read a little bit here. It says, many kings of Assyria had displayed proudly their cruelty toward their enemies. Sometimes in reliefs or in their annals, Assyria gave details of their gory exploits against their opponents. King Ashurnasirpal laid out many of his sadistic activities in one of his annals. He liked burning, skinning, and decapitating his enemies. When he defeated a rebelling city, he made sure they paid a huge price. Disobedient cities were destroyed and razed to the ground with fire, and their wealth and all material riches taken by the king. And it goes on, and then even talks in some places about them displaying the mutilated bodies of their torture victims in front of the cities that they wanted to take over. And so how do you think the average Jerusalem dweller felt about this invasion? Anxious, stressed, fearful and worried about themselves and about their loved ones, hard time sleeping, on edge. Now, for those points, I just read from a COVID-19 mental health website. But do you think they canceled any events in Jerusalem? Do you think maybe the storeroom ran out of a few things? That some of the shelves were bare? Do you think the people had extra appreciation for those people manning the walls who were on the front lines, so to speak? You know, when something like this happens, I start to think somebody should do something. And I even start to blame others, someone, anybody. But of course, I would only blame someone who I know is guilty. Some country didn't handle COVID correctly. Some politician didn't act swiftly enough. I want justice, by which I usually mean I want somebody to pay. The perpetrator needs to pay for their crimes. How could they do that? You know, I think back to my oldest, my daughter, when she was very young. She was just a little girl, and she first heard the story set during Jesus' childhood years about King Herod, who killed all the infants 2 years old and younger. And my daughter heard about that. She actually stood up and shouted, "He can't do that!" And she wanted me, as her dad, to do something about it. And I tried explaining to her that it already happened. It's history. It's a long time ago. There's nothing we can do about it. And she didn't understand and why we couldn't do anything. But eventually she got it. And she cried. We tend to want to take revenge. It's even attractive to be the one to make it right. We love movies like The Equalizer. We see Denzel Washington serve up justice, and there's John Wick and The Shawshank Redemption and Kill Bill. There's a TV show called Revenge. There used to be a TV show called The Avengers. And why? Well, it's because that feeling it's marketable. It's common. It's something many relate to. But we shouldn't settle for being common. We want to convert revenge into compassion. When we're hurt, when we see someone else hurt, when we see something that seems to us unfair, we want to lash out and do justice. But the problem with that is, in Deuteronomy 32:35, vengeance belongs to me. I will repay. That's from God. In Proverbs 20:22, don't say, I will avenge this evil. Wait on the Lord, and he will rescue you. And that's repeated in Romans chapter 12. But I know that can be so frustrating. Can we do nothing? Well, we do have a job. We need to get busy putting things back to rights that others have damaged or taken. While retribution or vengeance is in God's hands, restoration, that's something we can offer. We can convert revenge into compassion. And wouldn't it be better if instead of getting busy, not to mention tired, inventing hurt to pay back those evildoers, we got busy helping those who've been hurt? I know if I were hurt, I'd appreciate it if somebody spent some time and effort comforting, helping, instead of spending all the best of their energy making up for payback. But when you understand how big a deal this Assyrian invasion was to the Jews, it'll come as no surprise that some of the prophets in the Bible had this Assyrian invasion as a backdrop for their writings. And so we're going to look at one of those, Jonah. Now, aside from the fact that he was swallowed by a fish, Jonah should be very relatable to us. So let's see. In Jonah 1, verse 1, the word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Get up, go to the great city of Nineveh, and preach against it because their wickedness has confronted me. However, Jonah got up to flee to Tarshish from the Lord's presence. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. He paid the fare, went down into it to go with them to Tarshish from the Lord's presence. So here Jonah is told to preach to the Assyrians in one of their greatest cities, Nineveh. And either because he's petrified of them, which would be understandable, or because he thinks that the vile beasts don't deserve to hear from God, which would also be understandable, he runs. And we know all about the big fish, and so we're going to skip chapter 2 and go to chapter 3, verse 1. Then the word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time. Get up, go to the great city of Nineveh, and preach the message that I tell you. So Jonah got up, went to Nineveh according to the Lord's command. Now Nineveh was an extremely large city, a 3-day walk. Jonah set out on the first day of his walk in the city and proclaimed, in 40 days, Nineveh will be demolished. So eventually, after a little bit of indigestion on the part of the fish, Jonah and God have another chat, and Jonah goes and does what he's told. Now look in verse 5 of chapter 3. The men of Nineveh believed in God. They proclaimed a fast, dressed in sackcloth, from the greatest of them to the least. And when the word reached the king of Nineveh, he got up from his throne, took off his royal robe, put on sackcloth, and sat in ashes. So that's how the Ninevites reacted. Now let's look at Jonah's reaction in Jonah chapter 4, verse 1. But Jonah was greatly displeased and became furious. He prayed to the Lord, "Please, Lord, isn't this what I said while I was still in my own country? That's why I fled toward Tarshish in the first place. I knew that you're a merciful and compassionate God, slow to anger, rich in faithful love, and one who relents from sending disaster. And now, Lord, please take my life from me, for it's better for me to die than to live." The Lord asked, "Is it right for you to be angry?" Jonah left the city and sat down east of it. He made himself a shelter there and sat in its shade to see what would happen to the city. Now notice Jonah's reaction. He is furious. He says that he would rather die than see the Assyrians get any chance at redemption. And then he pouts and he waits, hoping that God will see the light and give him payback. But even God is about converting revenge to compassion. And look in verse 11, God says, "Should I not care about the great city of Nineveh, which has more than 120,000 people who cannot distinguish their right from their left, as well as many animals?" There's a balance, but I think only God will be perfect in achieving it. Now, if it helps you to feel any better about your feelings of justice for the cruelty of the Assyrians, go read the prophet Nahum. There, in fact, God does talk about punishing the Assyrians for their arrogance, etc. But let's end with a verse or two from Isaiah, probably written after a couple of invasions against the Jews had wiped out the nation of Israel entirely for a time. And this is from Isaiah 58, verse 6, and it says this: "Isn't the fast I choose to break the chains of wickedness, to untie the ropes of the yoke, to set the oppressed free, and to tear off every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, to bring the poor and homeless into your house, to clothe the naked when you see him, and not to ignore your own flesh and blood? Then your light will appear like the dawn, and your recovery will come quickly." Now that's just a small piece of that general theme from Isaiah. Let's transform our feelings of vengeance into kindness. Let's convert revenge to compassion.